Live from the Stability and Trim for the Ship's Officers podcast studio, where the vessel's its own best instrument of stability and trim. Welcome. This is William George. Greetings and welcome. The first edition of Stability and Trim for the Ship's Officer was published in 1946. It was published as a result of the lack of any textbooks in the subject to teach the future ship's officers that were going to the United States Merchant Marine Academy at the time. And the book was actually composed from the best students' notes, lecture notes that were reviewed by the instructors. Now, I need to tell you some background history about how we've got from there to here and how things have changed. In the late 1930s, with the advent of World War II in Europe, Winston Churchill came to America and asked President Roosevelt to give him permission to build ocean-class vessels of about 10,000 tons in America because the British shipyards were being bombed. Roosevelt basically was in a situation where America was just coming back from a big depression. People were out of work. America was not entered into any World War II at this time. And the position was that America would be the arsenal of weapons for the European war. The British came with their technology, and they showed Americans how to build Liberty and Victory type vessels. Their vessels were the original 30 that they requested to be built, and they were called ocean-class vessels. To look at these steamships, it would resemble an old-fashioned motor lifeboat, double-ended with engine room in the middle and a propeller coming out the back end. It was designed to have a dead weight of 10,000 tons, so it could enter shallow draft ports. It was a general cargo vessel, so it could unload itself. And this was basically a British design. One of their innovations was they introduced welding the ship, not riveting it together, which made it a lot more faster and economical to build. After the first 30 ships were built, Roosevelt ordered 2,000 more to be built, now that we knew how to do it. And a shipyard could easily employ 10,000 people working around the clock. And these ships were built in very fast order. Now, the thing to keep in mind is I found this out by watching a historical video of how these original ocean-class vessels were built and how the following Liberty and Victory ships were built. And I started to ask myself, well, where were we going to get all the officers for 2,000 vessels? Figuring you'd need a captain, a chief mate, a second mate, and at least a third mate, maybe 2 third mates back then, who knows. I looked at the educational statistics for America around 1937, 1938. It turns out that after the Great Depression in America, only about 8% of the population had completed, or the median education, not 8%, but the median education in America in that time was the 8th grade. 4% of the population had completed college. So, we're going to train ship's officers. Now, if you've only completed the 8th grade, that means hopefully you can read and do some math. And as I understand, what happened was the people that could not read, they became unlicensed crew. The people that could read and do math, probably at an 8th to 6th grade level, could be trained with the books and tables and things provided to man a vessel to cross the ocean in a convoy situation and deliver the goods to the European theater. So here's the interesting thing. The licensing all started, this mass licensing during World War II and after World War II was based on the Victory and Liberty ship. These ships were small, stability was critical, draft wasn't, trim wasn't. The book basically starts off by the title of the book is Stability and Trim for the Ship's Officer. The original books really didn't mention hull strength until I did the third edition in 1983. Hull strength was addressed in other books such as Modern Ships, which were done by the similar authors, Ladage and Van Germet, as they taught at King's Point. Anyway, keep in mind, they kept everything simple. Tables were made for celestial navigation, for stability books were made for stability and trim with worksheets, but they were built for the Victory and Liberty ships. Now, to this day, the Stability Data Reference Guide still talks and references basically the old Victory ship MARAD format in the stability books, booklets used for the license exam. So it's sort of a historical thing, but just imagine if you're trying to create 2,000 officers for 2,000 ships. That means you need 6,000 to 8,000 people trained to do something. Back then, during the convoy wars, there were 24-year-old captains because they had made a couple trips and they advanced people much quicker than they do today. It's just a historical note. I think it's worth keeping in mind. Now, today the ships are bigger. Draft restrictions are common in most ports. So really, managing the trim and the hull strength, or maybe the hull strength and trim first, is critical, unless you're on maybe a car carrier, which seems to have problems to this day with mismanaged tanks and controlling the initial stability of the vessel. But primarily dry bulk ships, Panamax size, handy size ships, their beam has increased so much that they're not as critical for stability, but their draft has increased, so trim is where the chief mate earns his money now. If I had to write this book from scratch starting today, I might talk about hull strength, trim, and stability in the title. But the title still goes Stability and Trim for the Ship's Officer. It's an interesting situation. So let's keep in mind, the laws of physics haven't changed, but since 1946, ships have changed. They've gotten bigger. They have different constraints now than before. So the emphasis might be changed a little bit. Now, the license exam still tests you for basically the basic principles and definitions for ship stability and trim. Does it necessarily prepare you to actually be a chief mate or a master on a vessel? Maybe not. Because knowing about a subject is one thing, practicing a subject is something else. In my advanced stability course that I give at the Pacific Maritime Institute in Seattle, that's coming up this March, that course is a prerequisite for upgrading to chief mate and master. It's a refresher course on stability. We deal with license questions and actually some hands-on training on loading computers. But it's a required course. Now, does it prepare you to load a Panamax vessel and go through the Panama Canal, arriving zero trim, zero list, full maximum cargo, after you burn the fuel off to get there? Not really. They don't ask those type of questions. My Beyond Basic Stability and Trim workshop does. What I found out, there's only 5 basic things, calculations you need to know. They can all be written out on one piece of paper. So my book right now is about 505 pages. And in my workshop, I reduce it all down to one page where we talk about the assumed conditions I mentioned the other day, which are 0 trim, 0 list, density of full seawater, 1,025. The draft is at the LCF. The vessel is floating. There is no hog and sag assumed. And for the hydrostatics, that's the assumed condition you need to know. And then the weight moment calculation is where everybody seems to get lost, but it's a simple calculation. Trouble of it is there's so many numbers. People start off with good intentions on a 10-week course, and the second week they start doing weight moments. And the trouble of it is the instructors never mention to say a moment is nothing more than something times something else, the product of two numbers. Most likely, for the ship's officer, a weight times a distance. It also can be an area times a distance, or it can be a volume times a distance. So we have weight moments, area moments, volume moments. But all they are is something times something else. When you add up all the moments and divide by the total sum of the weights, the areas, or the volumes, you'll get where the center of that area, weight, or volume is. And there's some shortcut formulas. Then we have the initial stability formula for GM, which is good up to about 8 degrees. Righting arm should take over after 8 to 10 degrees, but the trouble of it is most people don't realize your main engine will stop, if it's a diesel ship, at about a permanent list of 18 degrees because of the lubrication problems. So the whole ball is played in very small angles of heel. Rolling is different. Permanent list is what the reference is. Then we have the draft calculation. The draft calculation is kind of simple. It's adding up all the known weights: light ship, fuel oil, diesel oil, fresh water, ballast, constant, and cargo, and coming up with a weight, which we can look up on a dead weight scale or a hydrostatics table. If we know the total weight or displacement of the vessel, then we can get a reference draft to where the draft should be, and guess where that will be? It will be at the longitudinal center of flotation. Then finally, trim. Trim is a very interesting thing, and it's displayed poorly in the Stability Data Reference Guide because they leave out 2 steps. But the basic steps are LCB minus LCG equals the trimming arm. The trimming arm, or trimming lever if you want to call it, times the displacement is the trimming moment, dividing by MT1 will give you the trim of the vessel in inches. If we have it in metric, dividing by MTC will give you the trim of the vessel in centimeters. And the trim is the true trim marked at the perpendiculars, not at the draft marks. If you want to be able to improvise doing these, the secret, which is not taught at the schools, and it is introduced into this 4th edition of the book, and the 5th or 6th edition will be really emphasized, is being able to play these backwards. Because if I know the trim, I can work the steps backwards, and I can get the longitudinal center of gravity. How do I do it? The trim in centimeters measured at the perpendiculars times the moment to trim 1 inch is the trimming moment, dividing by the displacement is the trimming arm. I look up LCB. LCG will be toward the deep end by the distance of the trimming arm. No weights needed, cargo weights needed, no tank weights needed. Okay, it's time to go.